Hello and welcome to Goldster Inside Story, where from way across the Atlantic Ocean, we are going to have our first ever book show looking at science fiction, the storytelling of imaginary worlds that has captured imaginations for years. I am Humphrey Hawksley, your host for the next compelling hour, and my guest, up early and waiting patiently through my introduction, is in Toronto, Canada, and the winner of all three of science fiction's major prizes. He is the right person to talk to, and we're so lucky to have him on Goldster. Now, before we begin, please put in the chat your favorite science fiction story and why. Is it Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth, Frank Herbert's epic drama Dune, which I think has had a film made out of it recently, Star Trek, that blockbuster series, or even the Rocky Horror Show, or Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or something else I haven't mentioned? My guest has a vast range of work, which you will see listed among his books. The Oppenheimer Alternative, his latest, Flash Forward, Frame Shift, Hominids, the Neanderthal Parallax and Starplex, and others. He takes us into the human mind, into outer space, into computing, and into the future. The American Library Association magazine book list says Sawyer, not only an irresistibly engaging narrative voice, but also a gift for confronting thorny philosophical conundrums. At every opportunity, he forces his readers to think while holding their attention with ingenious premises and superlative craftsmanship. So, without further ado, welcome Robert J. Sawyer to Goldster Inside Story.
Thank you, Humphrey. I'm delighted to be here.
And thanks for getting out so early. Now, what do we call you? Robert, Mr. Sawyer, Bob?
Rob. Rob is what I'm usually called.
Rob. Okay, Rob it is. Now, when we corresponded, you said you were not a morning person. It's just past 7 in Toronto. So how are you feeling?
I feel fine. It is early in the morning for me. And, one of the joys of being a self-employed writer is you sleep when you're tired. You write when you feel it's time to write. So once we're done here, Humphrey, I'm going back to bed. But I'm glad to have gotten up and share some time with the lovely people on the other side of the pond.
That's brilliant. So you're not going to go straight to your desk and write, but just to encapsulate for us, because we're going to delve into this genre of science fiction that we haven't done before on Goldster.
Yes.
What is it?
So there are many, many definitions of it. And, the term is much of a misnomer because it is not fiction about science, nor is it fictional science, made up stuff. I actually don't even like the term science fiction. I much prefer the term philosophical fiction because it really is the literature of ideas. And, people tend to abbreviate science fiction sci-fi. Well, if we went with my term, we could still have a cute abbreviation of fi for philosophical fiction. And, when we talk about it, we like to give people something to chew on, right? When you finish a regular novel, if it's just an entertainment, at the end of it, you go, oh, that was okay. And, not to disparage romance readers, but romance readers are famously voracious readers, right? As soon as they finish one, they read another and another and another and another and another. There are many romance readers who will do 10 or 20 novels a month because once you've finished one, that's it. You've had the emotional experience and it's over. And the only thing to do again is get that emotional experience again. A science fiction writer tends to make less money in his career than a successful romance writer because our books require reflection after the completion of reading them. You read a science fiction novel and we want you to go, oh, I hadn't thought about that. That's another way of looking at the world. I got to think about this. I got to go find Joe and have a conversation with him and say, have you read this guy? What do you think about this idea he put forward? And so it's a fiction of reflectivity, of asking questions that you're supposed to as an exercise for the reader. We don't necessarily give you the answer, but we hopefully expand your mind and get you thinking.
Well, that's so I'm going to rephrase my request to our beautiful audience is that tell us what your favorite philosophical mind-stimulating book is. And then we can see whether you think that's science fiction. So anything that you think is science fiction, but anything that's really jolted your mind and said that you want to go and talk to so-and-so about it and explore these ideas. And whilst that's happening, and anything at all can go, and if it's Noddy and Big Ears, that's great. Rob and I will deal with it. Or if it's Churchill's memoirs, that's great. They'll deal with it. But basically, we're looking at what we think is the science fiction genre. Now, your latest deals with a historical, event in a way, which is the building of the atomic bomb and the Manhattan Project. Well, let's say the character behind that, Robert J. Oppenheimer, in the Oppenheimer alternative.
I'm Robert J. He's J. Robert.
Oh,
J. Robert Oppenheimer.
What is this thing in North America about this single initial? We don't use that over here.
Oh, so, very much influenced by science fiction when I was choosing it. And you say you don't, but the most famous UK-born science fiction writer was Arthur C. Clarke, right?
Of course.
And
yes.
James T. Kirk. And of course, over here, we had Robert A. Heinlein. Yeah. So when I was looking for a name, I decided I'm going to do that. I'm going to use the middle initial. And I'm so glad I did, Humphrey, because you have this wonderful name, Humphrey Hawksley. If I Google that, I'm going to turn up you. You Google Robert Sawyer, you're going to get all these guys with drink driving convictions in the United States and deadbeat dads and all sorts of things. The J is what brings me up on Google, Robert J. Sawyer, and I'm the first hit with that particular combination.
Oh, I see. So it's a social media profile is the necessity for it.
Well, but I had no idea when I first used that byline in 1979. I had no idea that it was going to be search engine friendly. It's just been a boon to me that it turned out to be that.
Yes. So in the Oppenheimer alternative, we have Oppenheimer, we have Albert Einstein, we have a computing pioneer, John von Neumann, and a rocket designer, Werner von Braun, who tell us who they are and tell us why Publishers Weekly says science fiction fans will devour this smart, speculative tale.
Well, the Oppenheimer alternative, I set myself a challenge. It was my 24th novel, and I always try to do something I had never done before. From my previous novels, if somebody were to write to me, and sometimes people would, they would say, I don't think your character, say, of Caitlin in my novel Wake, would have done that. And I could answer quite rightly, actually, I'm the world's foremost authority on Caitlin, the main character of Wake, Watch, and Wonder. But I wanted to set a series of, a book that I could not say that, every character in the book was going to be real and famous. They all have numerous biographies written of them. Most of them, but not Oppenheimer himself, also wrote autobiographies. And there are people who devoted their entire academic careers to studying these individual characters. You mentioned several of them. Leo Szilard, Hungarian scientist, is also a main character. Enrico Fermi, Hans Bethe. These are the physicists mostly who were working on the Manhattan Project. And they were brought together in this isolated laboratory in Los Alamos, California, high on a mesa in the desert. The greatest scientific geniuses of the mid-20th century with the most ambitious scientific problem. You know, when Kennedy said, let's go to the moon, he said, before this decade is out, they were racing to try to end World War II as quickly as possible. And I will say they failed in their ambition. Their ambition was to bring down Adolf Hitler. Yeah. Many of these scientists were Jewish emigres or refugees from Europe. Oppenheimer himself Jewish, Enrico Fermi, not Enrico Fermi, excuse me, Leo Szilard, Albert Einstein, so many of these people. And they, quite rightly felt that Hitler was pure evil, and if he was allowed to take over the world, it would be the end, A, of their particular ethnicity, but B, of everything we held dear as human beings. And of course, Hitler did, with a simple off-the-shelf Luger, what all of that scientific undertaking failed to do, which is bring him down, right? He killed himself in April of 1945 in a bunker.
Yeah.
So what I was curious about was the moral conundrum. Do you continue to create the atomic bomb? Do you continue after the threat is essentially gone? And they went ahead and, as you know, bombed 2 civilian targets in Japan, targets that had been deliberately left untouched by the conventional bombing, the firebombing of Tokyo and so forth, specifically so there would be pristine laboratories on which to see what the effect of atomic bombs were on buildings, on human beings, on cities. It was in many ways a reprehensible thing to do. And these characters became, enormously morally conflicted. And that made them just irresistible to write about.
And then when the Publishers Weekly says a smart speculative tale, give us the speculation that you.
Yes. So, despite the fact that, as I said, there's been so much written about these people in the Manhattan Project, there are gaps in the record, some of which is still classified even now, 77 years later. But there are things we don't know about. And with Oppenheimer, he was brought before a security review board. And ultimately stripped of his security clearance. But when he was going in to those hearings, he said to a reporter, if a reporter, meaning the guy he was talking to, were to dig deeply enough, he would find that there is a much bigger story than just my security review. Well, nobody knows what he meant by that. Who knows what he meant? Well, that was catnip for a writer, right? What did he mean? What was what is that bigger story? So I set out to write a legitimate science fiction story, an extrapolative story that filled in those gaps in the history without contradicting anything we knew of that history. And that was the speculative part that Publishers Weekly very kindly mentioned and gave me credit.
And your speculation, if I'm right or wrong, is that they can create something that saves the world or brings peace to the world, or something that destroys it. They could go either way with that.
Well, that's right. Oppenheimer famously said when they invented the atomic bomb, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," which is his own translation of a line from the Bhagavad Gita. He was very much into the Bhagavad Gita. And what I wanted to do is give them at least the opportunity, or the alternative, the Oppenheimer alternative of my title, to perhaps be able to say at some point, instead of "now I'm become death, the destroyer of worlds," now we have become life, the saviors of our world. And that's the germ of the high concept, the elevator pitch for the Oppenheimer alternative.
So you've got a lot of it is based on fact and what we know, and then you take us into that sort of leap of imagination to somewhere else, and have to bring the reader with you, don't you? You can't suddenly say, the reader says, well, that would have never happened, I'm putting this book down. You have to draw us along.
Yes, it has to be plausible. This is the thing. Going right back to your first question, what is science fiction? Science fiction is the literature of a plausible alternative reality. It has to be believable. It has to be plausible. Science fiction is things that plausibly might happen. Fantasy is things that never could happen, although they're often in the same section of the bookstore. They, in fact, are orthogonal. They have nothing to do with each other. Yes. In a well-written science fiction story, there's no fantasy at all. Because as soon as you come to that point, Humphrey, we say, well, that never could happen, right? In a science fiction story, you're out of it. Whereas in a fantasy story, when a dragon swoops down and takes the protagonist on his or her back and flies away, I mean, we all know that never could happen, but it doesn't take us out of the fantasy story, whereas it's a showstopper for the science fiction story.
Because we have a note in here from, I don't know who this is. This is coming on iPad, about Arthur C. Clarke, who we were talking about, who did 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I read Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke over 20 years ago, and it still intrigues me.
Yes.
Also, not in this genre. Well, we don't know, not in this genre, but Catch-22 is very thought-provoking. Let's deal with each of those ones. Firstly, the Arthur C. Clarke one. Tell us about him in that book.
Yes, Arthur C. Clarke, of course, best known for having co-written the screenplay for 2001: A Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick's milestone 1968 science fiction film. And he had Clarke was selected by Kubrick because he was really one of the top 3 science fiction writers in the world by the mid 1960s. And he had a good decade after that where he was producing some really good books, Rendezvous with Rama and The Fountains of Paradise. His books more beyond that were sort of, as many an author does, they keep writing long past their peak. But Rendezvous with Rama, which has only one knock against it, utterly like devoid of characterization, but such fascinating big ideas in it. It's about a space probe that is visiting our solar system. And as it approaches our sun and warms up, a whole ecosystem inside this hollow tube space habitat comes to life. And there's a very brief window because it's just passing through. It's not come to visit us. It's indifferent to us. It's just kind of doing a pass through of our solar system. There's a very brief window for an expedition to go explore Rama. And it's really just a huge concept, fascinating story, and absolutely hard science fiction. I mean, I remember reading it. I couldn't read it the moment it came out because it came out in hardcover and I was a teenager, couldn't afford that. But I got the paperback as soon as it came out and thoroughly enjoyed that.
iPad is the person that asked is Chris Dyson. Chris, tell us what intrigued you about Rendezvous with Rama. Whilst I ask Rob about Catch-22, where does that is not science fiction, right?
That's not science fiction. It's a fascinating novel, Joseph Heller's Catch-22, about the impossible ability to get out of flying combat missions, right? Because if you're sane enough to know that it's too dangerous to do, then you're sane enough to continue doing them. Catch-22, and it's a great novel and a great motion picture version of it as well. But it's interesting. I was expecting people to throw out some of these titles that traditionally the Academy has discounted as being science fiction. The famous ones, everybody has studied science fiction in their English literature classes just without it being labeled as such, because they've read Brave New World, or they've read 1984.
Is 1984 science fiction?
Well, absolutely. Remember, it was written in 1948. Orwell just flipped the last 2 digits. And it is set in the future. What else could it be other than science fiction? Right? Brave New World is about genetic manipulation, about creating different casts of human beings in vitro, in glass. What could that be? Well, now, of course, we always say science fiction, science is catching up with science fiction. But at the time it was written, what else could it have been?
Yes.
But science fiction, set in the future, dealing with extrapolative science. These have to be science fiction. And we have this problem that the Academy has, for whatever reason, had a hate on for science fiction.
And when you talk about the Academy,
I mean the university English departments.
Oh, okay.
Have cherry-picked out certain works, going right back to the formative first work of science fiction, which was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and said, no, they're not science fiction. I said, well, if you take any field, you take mystery fiction, you take literary fiction, and you pull out all the good ones and say they aren't that, and then you leave behind the worst exemplars and say that's what literary fiction is. It's pretentious, plotless, goes nowhere, self-indulgent, right? And you go, no, literary fiction is really important. It gets into the human condition. And no, I took all those works out and called them something else, right? They don't do that with any other category of fiction, but they do it routinely with science fiction.
How interesting, given how it does capture our imaginations. We have another one here from Annem. When I was still a child, My big brother was, we had Fahrenheit 451.
Yes, or Celsius 233, as we call it here in Canada.
No, they really changed the
No,
title.
no, 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 no.
451, and how much Annem liked it, found it very interesting. That's Kurt Vonnegut, isn't it?
No, that's Ray Bradbury.
Oh, Ray Bradbury, that's right. Yes.
But again, we come back to how many of these stories, it's one of the purposes of science fiction is not to predict the future. It is to prevent the future. Bradbury himself said that. My job is not to predict the future. It's to prevent the future. And Fahrenheit 451, which was, that's he said the combustion point of the paper that books are printed on, 451 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
It's about burning of books. And what we're facing, and very much in the United States currently, I'm in Canada, but in the United States, there's a huge movement to purge from libraries books on controversial topics. One of the topics that, has become very fraught is the teaching of American history related to slavery. That was a country that had enormous amount of dehumanizing, horrific slavery. One of the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, having fathered children by slaves, and this idea that you can somehow go and expunge that. Well, this is one of the things Bradbury was warning us about in the 1950s when he wrote Fahrenheit 451, that you can't allow those in power to determine what ideas are fixed in a permanent form, where you can go back to, this is what Sojourner Truth, or this is what Harriet Tubman, or this is what Frederick Douglass said. This is their truth recorded for all time. If you put that into the fire pit, then you are manipulating the mind. And it's a horrific thing. But science fiction over and over again. 1984 was warning us about totalitarianism. And we, Italy just, how did it go last time you had a totalitarian government, right? And they just elected another one. The science fiction writer is so often a Cassandra, the character from Greek mythology, the prophetess who knew the future, would freely tell anybody, Humphrey, I know your future, let me tell you all about it. And you would go, bah, I don't believe you, right? Cassandras were constantly writing tales of warning in hopes not that they will come true, but in hopes that society, time for a course correction. We can choose our future, choose which path we want. And that one, now that it's been explicated for us by a science fiction writer, we'll go a different direction.
Arthur C. Clarke in 2001: A Space Odyssey was warning us about computers taking over our world.
Right. HAL is the quintessential example of, there's a thing called perverse instantiation in artificial intelligence theory. Didn't have the name when Clarke wrote it, but it was this notion that you'll give a computer an instruction, and it will find a perverse, that is an incorrect, a way that we find morally reprehensible way of executing that instruction, because it doesn't think the way we do. Well, HAL's instruction was protect the mission at all costs, right? And all costs meant killing all the astronauts, right? And never in a million years did its programmers ever anticipate that it would perversely interpret its instructions as a license to become homicidal.
Yeah, and that's I mean, that's all to do with artificial intelligence that we're hearing a lot about today. But it was written, back in the 60s, wasn't it?
That's right. HAL came out in the movie came out in 1968. And in the novel, in the movie, HAL says that he became operational at the HAL lab in Urbana, Illinois, on the 12th of January. 1997, right? 1992, excuse me, 1992. 97 in the novel, 92 in the movie. And when in 1992, on the anniversary of HAL's birth, or HAL's birthday, MIT Press published a great book called HAL's Legacy, where they interviewed everybody who was working in artificial intelligence, and to a person. This is, the 90s instead of the 60s. So, 3 decades later, to a person, every one of them cited HAL as their inspiration to getting into that field. So science fiction does have a salutary purpose in that it does inspire young minds to go into careers of science, of engineering, of physics, and philosophy, absolutely into philosophy.
In a moment, I want to go to dig deeper into your own books, because they go from the mind to space to computers and to everything. But R.S. Welford has come up with the H.G. Wells, The Time Machine and War of the Worlds. Science fiction?
Absolutely. In fact, Mary Shelley is the grandmother of science fiction. She created it with Frankenstein. Wells is the father of science fiction. And one of the things that science fiction does so well is it lets us talk about thorny issues with that people would not be predisposed to engage with by using metaphors or disguises. So, you know, the War of the Worlds is not really about a Martian invasion of Earth. It is Wells saying to his countrymen, almost all of the novel takes place in Great Britain, to his countrymen, what would you feel like if what we are doing as the British Empire to people all over the world, striding into their lands, crushing underfoot. This is the imagery right out of the novel, the tripod machines that stride in and crush underfoot indigenous cultures. What would you feel like if that was happening here? He was trying to raise the social conscience. The Time Machine is also his, you know, it's not about a trip to the year 802, 701 AD. It's about the British class system and how not only is it bad for the working class, which everybody knew at that time, the working class knew it, and the leisure class knew it. It's bad for the leisure class. The leisure class ends up being feckless, ineffectual, incapable of looking after themselves, mentally weak. He said, if you don't do any labor for yourself, you end up being this childish weakling physically and weakling mentally. He was very much a social commentator. Those are the books that set the template for my career, are those two H.G. Wells novels.
And was it Orson Welles who did the radio play of War of the Worlds? That
Orson Welles, that's right.
Everybody halted because they thought it was actually happening.
That's right. Halloween, actually, October 30th, 1938, the Mercury Theater, Orson Welles, and just done as the first time it had ever been done, a mockumentary on radio, right? It appeared to be actual news coverage, you know, and it brilliantly done. Orson Welles adapting H.G. Wells, exactly. Yes.
And it's now at the end of the show, I'm going to ask you who your favorite science fiction writer is, apart from yourself, of course.
Oh, I'm not even my favorite.
But meanwhile, keep the ideas coming from the audience. Keep the names out, because Rob knows all about these people and can dig a lot deeper into them. Chris lost the connection on the Catch-22 thing. Just sum up for us what Catch-22 was. It wasn't science fiction, but sum up for us again.
No,
Rob.
Sorry. Catch-22 is about military airplane crews who don't want to fly these dangerous missions, but if they're sane enough to say, I don't want to fly these dangerous missions, they can't get out on the it's, you know, insanity clause, right? If you're sane enough to know it's too dangerous to do, then you got to do it, and that's Catch-22. It's any provision that you can't find a way out of, and it's a great satiric novel in the tradition, not of the novel MASH, but the TV series and movie. The novel MASH is actually written by quite a right-wing fellow, Richard Hooker, who declined to have credit on the TV series because he really didn't like. He felt that the United States was justified being in Korea. And didn't really like what they did on the TV series. Iris
lost her connection, and we talked a lot about H.G. Wells and how it was a sort of founding inspiration to your own career. But another one, The Fly.
The Fly, which is, you know, most famously, there are two movie versions of it. Younger people will remember the Jeff Goldblum Gina Davis version, and older people remember the Vincent Price, David Hedison version. But it's about a teleportation experiment, what they called on Star Trek the transporter, and the idea that you could actually, in the original fly, they were going to beam somebody from Montreal, great Canadian content in there, to Europe, I think it was. And a fly gets into the chamber, and when it's reconstituted, the fly's characteristics, bug head and palpating mouthpieces, are all mixed in with the human body. And that, this is very much a standard story generation idea in science fiction, is you take an invention that sounds like a good idea at the time. And this goes right back to the Oppenheimer alternative, the atomic bomb. Well, how else can we defeat Hitler, right? Yeah. Take an invention that sounds like a good idea at the time, and then it goes horribly wrong. And the teleportation device goes horribly wrong in the fly. I go back and forth whether the Vincent Price version or the Jeff Goldblum version is better, but they're both spectacular films.
It's your own background, Rob. How do did you get a university degree in science or physics or imagination? I mean, how does that all work?
I have a degree in broadcasting from what is now called Toronto Metropolitan University, just renamed itself. Used to be Ryerson University in Toronto. No, the way I look at it is, I am. You can be a sports fan. Nobody ever says to you, do you have a degree in physical education if you follow your favorite, rugby team? No, I don't. I just follow them. I know all the stats. I know all the figures. I know all the players. I can tell you all about it. I personally can't. I have no interest in that. But for me, my sport is science. I know all the players. I can give you all the facts and figures. I read voraciously about it. And for me, it is a spectator sport. I'm one of those who watches science with great interest. As we're doing this just now, Humphrey, this past week, or I guess the week before, was the annual announcement of the Nobel Prize winners, right? Most of which are in science. There's Peace Prize, there's economics, literature. I shouldn't say most, but there's also physics, chemistry, and physiology and medicine. So 3 of them are for scientific areas. And I watch with great interest. And in one of my novels, I was very lucky in one of my guesses, because I wrote a novel called Flash Forward that came out in 1999, predicting who would win the Nobel Prizes in physics in 2009. And I was right. As a spectator, as a person watching who's doing interesting research, what is cutting edge here, what is going to stand the test of time, which is part of the problem Nobel has had. Originally, Alfred Nobel's will said to be presented in these categories to the person who in the preceding year had done the most to better humanity.
So hold on, when you said you predicted it, you predicted the name or the type?
Oh, no, the names, the actual laureates.
The name of the laureate?
Yeah. I'd been looking, what research is being done here in the late 1990s that is cutting edge and interesting, but will take about a decade for it to be assessed. This is where Nobel's will is ignored now. We don't do the past year because there were early science Nobel laureates where the award was given to people whose ideas sounded good at the time and then were discredited a few years later. Oh, well, that guy was completely wrong, but he's a Nobel laureate for the rest of time, right? So now we wait to see, generally speaking, in the sciences, absolutely, we wait and see if it stands the test of time, where there's still a tendency, famously, I don't want to go off on a Nobel rant here, Barack Obama, won the Nobel Peace Prize without having done anything.
No, right? I mean, by getting elected president, essentially.
That's right. By being elected the first, African-American president, that's enough to, well, no, that actually, there have been politicians who quite obviously have done way more for peace. Not that he was a scourge or anything, but you don't give the Nobel Prize aspirationally. You give it to people who have done something that has stood the test time.
Sounds a bit of sort of science fiction forecasting and Nobel Prize giving there with Barack Obama. But I wanted to I mean, you've talked this vast array of stuff, and it takes, you know, a year or whatever to write a book and get it published. How do you sift through? How do you come up with the idea that you want to go with for the next year?
Well, so I used to do a book a year, absolutely. And I've slowed down. I do a book every few years now. The Oppenheimer Alternative took well over 2 years to write, the first year of which was simply research, which is my favorite part of the process. I read everything there was to read about these people with no preconception. This is the key. I go in with a completely open mind and say, okay, I want to know everything there is to know about Oppenheimer. I want to know everything there is to know about.
But what made you pick on him, Rob, as opposed to that vast array of other ideas that were banging about? What made you think this is the one I'm going to do?
Partially, we were coming up on the 75th anniversary of the first atomic bomb explosion, the Trinity test, which was the 75th anniversary was 2 summers ago. 2 summers ago is when my book came out. So, you know, people ask, well, how do you make science fiction relevant? Well, you rip things from the headlines. So you talk about race relations and genetic manipulation and you know, women's rights and all the things that are, and the fear of nuclear war, which was the theme of one of the themes of Planet of the Apes, for instance, 1968. You talk about what's in the headlines now, but also if you want a book to sell well, you try to think what's going to be in the headlines when the book is actually on shelves. And there was going to be, I thought, well, what can I write about that's going to be au courant, not just about the future, but the 75th anniversary is going to have an enormous amount of coverage. Now, I was defeated by COVID and my book tour got canceled, but the idea was a good one. as Oppenheimer said, it seemed like a good idea at the time.
It's a mix of where your passion lies and what you're really interested in, and also what the market's going to accept. So you balance those two up.
Right. Yeah. You know, I have areas of interest. I am probably the world's foremost living authority on WordStar for DOS, a 1990s vintage, well, 1990s when it went off sale, 1992. Vintage word processing program. I can tell you, you know, George Martin still uses it, but he's nowhere near as adept at it as I am. But I'm not going to write a book about that at this point because there's a market. Me and George would be like the two people who you know, and since I would get a free author's copy, I can only sell one to George. Now he can afford to pay millions for that one copy, but I don't think he's going to.
And George is fantasy, isn't he, and not science fiction? He is.
Now George has written great science fiction prior to Game of Thrones. He's certainly put feet in both camps. There's a wonderful story by him called Sand Kings, which is a science fiction story. But he definitely became this phenomenon because of Game of Thrones, which is absolutely fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, it's fantasy. I'm now going to go on. I want to go through very quickly some of your books because each of them has got a sort of what you call a high concept element to explain to us, but keep coming to us, any science fiction authors, any science fiction films or whatever that you want us to discuss or Rob to explain, keep them coming in. Flash forward.
Yes, now this is my most famous work, if any of my work is famous, because it was made into a television series on ABC, the American Broadcasting Corporation, in 2009, 2010, starring Joseph Fiennes and John Cho. And it's about everybody on Earth getting a glimpse of what their lives are going to be like in the future. And with that foreknowledge, could you prevent that future from coming true? So this is a classic Robert J. Sawyer philosophical fiction, right? It's asking a question. Do we have free will? If you knew, and I'll tell you where, by the way, you asked where ideas come from. That came from a 20th anniversary high school reunion. I was at I graduated high school in 79. So in 99, I was at a reunion. And everybody was saying, actually, it was my 20th anniversary starting class. So anyways, everybody was saying, if I'd only known then what I know now, my life would have been so much better. I wouldn't have done that wrong major at university. I wouldn't have married that idiot. I wouldn't have taken that dead end job. I would have, whatever. Everybody was convinced to a person at this event that foreknowledge of the future would be a boon, would be a benefit, and that with foreknowledge, they would change their life. And I thought, is that really true? You know, on January 1st, we all make our New Year's resolutions. How many of us are still keeping them on February 1st?
Yes.
Despite the best intention of altering our future. You know, we're going to give up a bad habit. We're going to read more books. We're going to, whatever we're going to do, we have every good intention of altering who we are and our destiny, and then we don't. So that's where that novel came from, Flash Forward, and the TV series.
So you're because there's a specific time span that your characters can see into the future, isn't there? It's not like days or months.
So in the TV series, well, in the novel, it's 21 years. It's a big hunk.
Oh, okay.
And, you know, that's far enough down the road where you go, oh, you know, this marriage isn't going to work out, or, oh, I'm going to be dead in 21 years, you know, it's just kind of a scary thought. Yeah. And in the TV series, Dave Goyer and Brandon Braga, who wrote the pilot, wanted to make it 1 year. And I said, well, if you're going to make it 1 year, make it 6 months, because then you can visually distinguish the two time frames. One will be summer and one will be winter. And also then we can go, and what we ended up doing is doing it in real time. The series takes place over 6 months. Every week we're moving 1 week closer to the actual date of destiny. In our final episode, we catch up. We go from October to April, 6 months.
And give us an example of how a character changes what they do, or what they see, and how they change.
Well, one of our main characters is in the TV series, Joseph Hines plays an alcoholic whose marriage is falling apart because of his alcoholism. And he is desperate to try to, you know, he's in AA and he hasn't had a drink, right? He's under control. And what he sees 6 months down the road is he's, as he says famously in a clip, I was loaded, okay? He was absolutely blotto. And he's determined, you know, it's a very small human story, but he's determined to not have that come true, to fight his demons.
Yeah. Okay, so he sees that and does it. Next one, mind scan.
Yes, this is a recurring theme in my fiction. The notion that we might be able to do what, you know, Joe, who is running this behind the scenes, is doing for us right now, digitizing Humphrey and Rob, right? Well, Joe knows how to do that perfectly well. Can Joe make a copy of us? He certainly is. He's going to put this on YouTube or wherever this is going to go up on Humphrey's website. We clearly can digitize and copy visual images, songs, anything. Can we digitize and copy consciousness? So Mind Scan is about scanning minds and uploading versions of them into Android bodies or into a computer, and seeing if, you know, is that the same person? If the original is gone, is that the same person? If the original is still alive, which one owns the property? Which one has the right to vote, right? You know, Donald Trump would love to be able to make 500,000 exact clones of himself and have 500,000 votes in the election. Well, do we allow that, or does only one of them get to go to the ballot box?
So that's digitizing consciousness in the brain, or the thought process, and then
that's right.
And then duplicate it. Good.
And what that means for the question of person. Hominids is my novel that won the Hugo Award, the top international prize in science fiction, about a parallel Earth where Neanderthals survived till the present day and we did not, and a portal that opens up between the two realities in Sudbury, Ontario, Canada, and these two very different kinds of stewards of our planet, the rapacious, polluting, violent us, and the more pastoral, peaceful Neanderthals. I shouldn't say pastoral because they weren't herders, but they were, they found a way to be much more ecologically conscious stewards of the planet than we were. So this is, you know, I tend to be a little bit in front of the curve. A lot of science fiction these days is about ecological issues. Well, Hominids was about that 20 years ago. A lot of science fiction is about LGBTQ perspectives, hominids, all of my Neanderthals were bisexual. And I was writing, this, and was nominated. I'm straight, but I'm an ally of those who aren't. And I was very pleased to be nominated for the Galactic, that's a wonderful term, Galactic Spectrum Award for fiction that positively portrays LGBTQ plus lifestyles.
In the Neanderthal human world, how does the narrative change that they survived and we didn't? Because it's all to do with evolution and intelligence and everything, isn't it?
Well, that's right. And I go into a great deal of discussion of what it is in our consciousness that they lacked in our version of reality. And this is speaking of Nobel Prizes, Svante Pabo just won the Nobel Prize for creating the notion of paleogenetics, the idea that you could actually extract DNA from fossil bones, which before Pablo came along, he said, everybody said, you can't do that. It's just not possible. People weren't even trying. And Pablo came along and said, well, let's give it a try. And then he sequenced the Neanderthal genome. And at the time, that was a nascent science. And we were trying to pin down what tiny, we have 99.6% of our DNA is identical to Neanderthal DNA. And so it's that 0.4% is the difference between one species dominating and wiping out the other one. What were the particular factors? And I deal with that at some considerable length in hominids.
How interesting. There's a little switch there, and we have we have a different world. A couple of I'm going to interrupt. I've got a couple of more books of yours I want to talk about, but R.S. Welford asks, has Stephen Hawking, A Brief History in Time, ever influenced your writing? Stephen Hawking.
So one of the greatest thrills of my life was in, I think it was 2017, there's a conference called Starmus, and they were doing a celebration of Stephen Hawking in Tenerife, the Canary Islands. And they invited Hawking's favorite scientists and artists, and I was invited. I was the only science fiction writer invited. I got to meet Hawking, and of the people who were there, the speakers, half had Nobel Prizes, and of the other half were either astronauts or cosmonauts. And then of the quarter that was left, it was people like Brian Eno, who has a PhD in physics, but also from the band Queen, obviously, and Neil deGrasse Tyson, the great American director of the Hayden Planetarium in New York City, and myself. Sarah Brightman, the singer, was there, who Hawking was quite a fan of. So Hawking, absolutely, of course, A Brief History of Time. Unlike most people who bought the book and didn't read it, I actually read it. And it's, yeah, absolutely.
Is he a non-fiction science fiction, non-fiction philosophy thinking forward writer? How would you describe that, Sean?
Well, yes, absolutely. And, Hawking was famous, and of course he's passed away now, but he was famously one of those who spoke up against the continuing effort to create artificial intelligence, right? He and Elon Musk and a couple of other really public intellectuals have said this is a very dangerous path to go down. Well, we science fiction writers were saying that decades and decades before they were saying it. They tend to be a little slow getting the message. But yes, absolutely saying, the thing is, if you make a mistake in creating brains that are brighter than yours, there's no going back, right? They by definition will be able to outwit you. So no matter how clever you think you are, we call it the AI control problem, making sure that we can control AI, artificial intelligence, no matter how clever you think you are, they're going to be more clever and they're going to outwit you. So
and
be careful.
Eventually they're going to
learn.
Hawking
was very much, he couldn't wag a finger, but he would, if he could, that finger would have been wagging.
Annam is quite an interesting one here, given the Oppenheimer alternative we were discussing. Not quite relevant, talking about Nobel. Nobel discovered explosives, which he thought would benefit mankind, but he saw them as being used primarily in wars to blow up people. To make amends, he instituted the Nobel Prize to benefit mankind. This is the sort of conundrum.
Well, you know what, really, that's absolutely true. But what's really fascinating is Nobel got to read his own obituary. He did not die. Eventually he did. 7 years later, his brother died, and a French newspaper ran the wrong obituary. The French editor was confused and ran Nobel's obituary under the headline in French, Dr. Death has, the Merchant of Death or whatever it was, has passed, talking about the horrible consequences of Nobel's creations. And Nobel was moved at very late in life by reading how his legacy was going to be perceived to ultimately alter his will and leave the vast bulk of his fortune to establish these prizes for the betterment of humankind. But imagine that. I mean, there's a great story, and it's true. The man got to see how history was going to judge him. He got to read his own obituary, and it changed him completely.
So is this what you would call flash forward meets the
He
Oppenheimer
did.
alternative?
Absolutely. That's right. A very, very good point, Humphrey. He got to get a glimpse of his own future, of how humanity was going to remember
and he
him.
changed.
And he didn't like it. And he changed. He changed.
And he changed it. And hence we have the Nobel Prize.
And yet, of course, there was no way to put the genie back in the bottle. He couldn't take back dynamite from the human race. But he realized that, there's some good that I can do in life.
Chris has a couple of interesting points here. One I'm not quite sure about, Chris, but you can tell us. The demonstration of AIDA or AIDA in the House of Lords recently was clever but scary. I think this is
Yes.
they did it in our upper house. Hal on legs will soon be here. So this is a sort of thing. But she also says further down, would Asimov's 3 laws protect us against AI?
So there are 2 answers to that. The first is no, and the second one is no, and I'll explain why they're both no. The first one is nobody is putting those laws in. There's not a single person at Google or Amazon or or MIT's Media Lab or any of the, or University of Toronto where AI work is being done, whose job it is to put in those rules.
Well, what are the rules?
Laws, a robot may not harm a human being, and actually, I'll say all 3 of them. The 3 laws of robotics: a robot may not harm a human being, or through inaction, that is not doing anything, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. 2, a robot must obey all orders given to it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And 3, a robot must protect its own existence, except where such rules would conflict. Such protection would conflict with the first or second law. And that brings me to the second note. If you change the word robot to slave and the word human being to plantation owner, you have a reprehensible set of rules. A slave must not harm a plantation owner, or through inaction allow a plantation owner to come to harm. A slave must obey all orders given to it by plantation owners, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And a slave, recognizing that it is the plantation owner's valuable property, must protect its own existence, except where such protection, blah, blah, blah. So they're reprehensible. If we actually, are setting out to create helpmates or companions to actually manufacture a race of slaves, is diminishing to us, just as slavery was diminishing to the slaveholders. It wasn't diminishing to the slaves in the sense that they had dignity and pride and individuality and spiritualism and all of that. They were under the lash and prevented from doing what they wanted to do. But it's the slave owner who is diminished by becomes inhuman through the act of enslaving. And so Asimov's laws, A, are reprehensible, and B, nobody is coding them in anyways.
That's give me 1 minute on calculating God.
Calculating God is my classic sci-fi philosophical fiction. It is about a paleontologist in Toronto who is confronted by an extraterrestrial being, an alien who has come to look at the fossil collections on Earth to forward the alien's belief that we live in a created universe. The alien believes the more that it looks at the evidence of the evolution of life on different worlds, the more proof it will find that God actually exists. The paleontologist is an atheist who is, the character drama, dying of lung cancer in the novel. And in the last year of the paleontologist's life, he and this alien form a fast friendship while they debate issues of evolution versus creationism.
Okay, so and the word calculating is a calculated word, I presume, in that
Absolutely,
in that God,
because
it's not something of the heart, it's something of the head.
it is, well, but also that word calculating we use for manipulative, right?
Yes,
That guy's a
yes.
cold calculating SOB, right? Manipulative, as well as calculating, we're going to figure out through ratiocination the actual answer to what God is like, if God exists. And also, if God exists, perhaps God was very manipulative. So
Okay.
that's the double meaning of calculating in that title.
Rob, I want you to sit there patiently, but there's a couple of things in the chat, including a very interesting symbol from Chris. Have a look at them whilst I tell our audience what is coming up next. Tomorrow, October 14th. Is it 14th? Yes. All the way from Bangkok in Thailand, I'm with the crime writer Jake Needham, who's the creator of Samuel Tay, a cranky, smoking, brilliant Singaporean detective, and Jack Shepherd, these are two separate series, a once high-flying American lawyer who now works out of a borrowed office in Hong Kong. On Tuesday, October the 18th, I'm with Purpose, Passion and Grit, our sister show, with war correspondent Lynn O'Donnell. She recently returned from reporting on to report on Afghanistan under the Taliban to find herself detained, threatened, and forced to confess to false reporting. She's had other narrow escapes to what makes someone choose a life of high risk. On Thursday, October the 20th, Lucinda is with the great Nicholas Solomon, chief executive of our trade union, the Society of Authors, asking her about authors' lives, struggles, and how it all works between agents, authors, and publishers. And then on the 21st, Lucinda talks to Alison Hill, the author of Pauline Gower, pioneering leader of the Spitfire Women. That's the amazing group of women who flew Spitfires during World War II and left a huge legacy for women in aviation. That is an incredible little known story. Did you know about that, Rob? I didn't know.
I did not. That's fast. I'll have to tune in.
I mean, it's absolutely incredible. Now, we have a couple of questions from Asuri. Do you think COVID-19 is the result of biological warfare experiment gone wrong?
I do not, but it is worth wondering about. It's, it almost certainly arose in a wet market in Wuhan, China, where seafood and live animals were sold for food. But it is certainly coincidental or interesting coincidence that is very close to a high security bio containment laboratory. I think that is a coincidence. I think it's been pretty well investigated at this point. The thing is, China is a 1.4 billion people. That's the last country on earth that's going to be playing around with pathogens that can cause enormous amounts of death. It makes no sense. I don't think so. Certainly, if it's a biological warfare thing, now it could have come out of a crazy country. China does not have a crazy leadership.
Yeah,
Russia has crazy leadership. North Korea has crazy leadership.
We just found out.
So if you wanted to postulate that it was created in some madman's lab or madwoman's lab, that lab was probably in North Korea or Russia. Certainly not in the People's Republic.
Not that. Chris has left an interesting thing, which I think, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, me equals human being. I think that's what it says on there, which is great. And then Chris says, fabulous program. Thank you, Rob and Humphrey. Iris, thank you. Robert would have liked another hour listening to your amazing knowledge. Plus, and here is a question for you. Have you met an alien?
I have not met an alien, but I feel very much like Spock, because Spock is half human, half Vulcan. And I'm both a Canadian and American dual citizen. My mother's an American. Well, she passed away. My father was Canadian. And those two worldviews, peace, order, and good government, which are the Canadian founding declaration principles, versus life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Peace, order, good government. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. There's definitely two different worlds colliding along the 49th parallel, the longest undefended border in the world, and they are like the two hemispheres of a mind. They are very much in opposition.
And which one is Neanderthal?
So the Neanderthals of the peace, order, and good government. You're very, very insightful to ask that, because absolutely the subtext of that series is the Neanderthals represent Canadian values and the Homo sapiens represent American values in that series.
And before we let you go back to your sleep, Rob, who is your favorite science fiction writer, and what is your favorite science fiction work?
So there are two different answers. Arthur C. Clarke is the favorite writer, the great Brit who moved to Sri Lanka. My favorite science fiction novel, and I got to do the introduction for the most recent audiobook edition, Gateway by Frederick Pohl, P-O-H-L, American writer. Gateway, I think, is the finest science fiction novel ever written.
Give us the top line on Gateway.
Gateway is about a man racked with guilt being psychoanalyzed by a computerized psychiatrist. And it is such a gut-wrenching exploration of that notion of guilt, of having done something that in the past that you can't escape from. And it really is a powerful emotional story.
Oh, that is great. And our time is unfortunately up, although we could have gone on, but then you wouldn't have got your beauty sleep. Thank you, Robert, for a really illuminating show. And my God, didn't we cover some ground?
My pleasure. I'm delighted to be here.
Science fiction. We
Live long
didn't do
and
the Rocky
prosper.
Horror Show, though, did we?
We didn't.
Thank you all for being here, and for everybody who contributed. Until tomorrow, with Jake Needham in Bangkok. Stay reading, stay curious, stay active, stay safe, and of course, stay Goldster. Thanks, Robert, and for getting up so early. Bye,
Cheers.
everybody.
Bye-bye.